My function here tonight is purely ceremonial. The occasion justifies a few ritualistic syllables of celebration, for it marks the launching of a series of 10 poetry readings at the Guggenheim Museum under the sponsorship of the Academy of American Poets, which I am moved to say is a far more adventurous and free-hearted enterprise than that official appellation might suggest. Can you all hear me, by the way? All of us in the arts dream fondly, which used to mean foolishly, of a friendly community of the arts. And it is in fact possible in this city, as nowhere else in America, to have at least some intimation of the excitement and satisfactions of such a fellowship, particularly among painters and poets. Some even dare to think of trying marriage. The present arrangement between the poets in this museum can scarcely be called a marriage, but it may accurately be described, I hope, as a beginning of what promises to be a most enjoyable affair. If this society of ours made any sense whatever in cultural terms, all of Frank Lloyd Wright's marvelous ramps would not be capacious enough to hold the thousands swarming to hear the poets we are so lucky to have with us tonight. Robert Lowell and John Berryman are two poets in their 40s who have most clearly demonstrated their authority, their force, their inventiveness, and their staying power. The last is rather important. They are poets who have already escaped from their generation and who belong to literature. They are voices to whom other poets listen, which is no mean tribute. When Robert Lowell published Lord Weary's Castle 17 years ago, Randall Jarrell greeted it with the accolade, "I can think of no one younger than Auden who has written better poetry than Robert Lowell's." Since then, he has won all the prizes, not to speak of all the praises, and nobody in this green-eyed world, or almost nobody, wants to take them away from him. In his more recent work, particularly in life studies, he has mastered a style at once intimate and open, sometimes verging on the confessional, which led me to comment that he had succeeded in recapturing a good portion of the territory that poetry has for so long yielded to the novel. John Berryman was born in Oklahoma, far from the New England of the vested Lowells. His most celebrated work to date is Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, a long poem that in its strangeness and power and nervosity stays alive, as do few modern poems of comparable length since The Wasteland and The Bridge. For several years, he has been a kind of underground poet, the kind you hear digging, at work on a sequence that I can only describe as indescribable. You'll soon be listening to it, and which will be published shortly as 76 Dream Songs. 2 hours ago I thought it was 75, but I've just been told it's 76. I have a hunch that the protagonist who walks through these poems, or should I say stumbles, jerks, freezes, jumps, a man the poet calls Henry, is going to be with us a long time. There's recently been published in England an anthology of the Penguin poets entitled The New Poetry, selected and introduced by A. Alvarez, a British critic with whom I don't always agree. But in this case it is of interest, certainly, and coincidental that the only two American poets whom he feels worthy of consorting with his British penguins are Mr. Lowell and Mr. Berham. And this is what Mr. Alvarez says about them. He's reviewing the poetry of the 40s and before. And he says a whole school of criticism was developed to prove technically that there was no necessary or even significant connection between art and its root in the artist's life. During the 40s, however, when English poetry was at its nadir, there arose in the States a new generation of poets, the most important of whom were Robert Lowell and John Berryman. They had assimilated the lesson of Eliot and the critical 30s. They assumed that a poet, to earn his title, had to be very skillful, very original, and very intelligent. But they were no longer concerned with Eliot's rearguard action against the late Romantics. They were, no longer adherents of the cult of rigid impersonality. So they were able to write poetry of immense skill and intelligence, which coped openly with the quick of their experience sometimes on the edge of disintegration and breakdown. I hope that nobody gets the impression, despite Alvarez and despite tonight's pairing, that these two poets constitute some sort of team. Actually, they don't think alike, write alike, or sound alike. I'm even tempted to add they don't even feel alike, but that might be misconstrued. But anyhow, I'm duly grateful for their differences. One of each is glorious. Mr. Lowell will read his poems first. There will be a short intermission, some 15 minutes or so, during which you can have coffee, smoke in the cafeteria, after which Mr. Berryman will read his poems without introduction. Thank you very much.